aren't companies measuring inclusion? The reason I believe for that is because inclusion is invisible. And let me explain what I mean by that. I like to use an analogy with health. When I introduced myself, when Moore introduced me, he didn't say, this is Paolo and he's very healthy. Now, if you had seen me about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, I had a mountain biking accident and I had a big pad on my shoulder. And it was very painful. And people said, oh, what happened? Oh, I fell off a bike, okay? Now, we don't notice when we're healthy. We notice when we are unhealthy. Similarly, we don't notice inclusion. That's why it's invisible. We only notice when we're missing inclusion. In other words, we notice when we're being excluded. And this has a very, very important corollary. If you are, like me, a leader of a company, you're white, you're male, you're straight, you have all your abilities, you are the least likely person to notice exclusion around you. Just like if you're a very healthy person, you don't know a lot about diseases. If you get included all the time, you don't notice that exclusion exists. And it creates this weird paradox where even the best intentioned leaders who want to embrace diversity and inclusion, they are clueless because they just don't see it. It's invisible to them, okay? Now, the health analogy was actually what led us to do the work that we're doing right now, which is that when you go to the doctor, they don't just ask you how healthy you are, they give you one of those annoying questionnaires. Why do they do that? Because they have studied over years constellations of symptoms that represent particular diseases, and then they can prescribe actions that will improve the situations based on your unique characteristics. Similarly, we have come up with a notion of what we call the 9 categories of inclusion. We have basically realized that when people feel excluded, we can typically bucket those kinds of exclusions depending on what aspect of your daily life at work are impacted. Is it about your access at participation? Is it about career opportunities? Is it about work-life balance? And just to give you a very quick example of what that looks like, in the category of respect, for example, what is respect? Well, respect is not being interrupted in meetings, having your opinion count, receiving credit for your contributions. In our work, we literally ask people to tell us about specific examples of when they felt excluded. And in the respect category, we get things like these. I'm always asked to take notes during team meetings. Or some of my colleagues make fun of my accent. Or I walked into a meeting in my new job and someone asked me if I could bring more coffee. And I'm sure that many of you in the audience, probably those of you who are not white and male, might have had these experiences before. We hear these kinds of things all the time. Now, there's another very important point, which is just as you don't get COVID just by being in your own home, you get it from somebody. The same is true with exclusion. Exclusion doesn't come out of the air. Exclusion comes from people. And this is just a small parenthesis, but it's the problem with focusing on a culture of inclusion, right? Because we tend to think of, oh, we did a survey and we found that 85% of the people feel that they're included. Or, we have an index of 85%. The problem is that 85% could mean that everybody feels included 85% of the time, or it could mean that 85% of the people feel included 100% of the time and 15% feel excluded all the time, right? And the point is that experiences do not result from culture, they result from people. So when we do our exercises, and I'm sorry, we're not gonna have time to do a full-blown inclusion exercise, but we literally ask people to tell us about experiences, and then we ask them to tell us about, is this experience because of a policy? Is it because of leadership? Is it because of management? Is it because of your peers or reports, or maybe even for people outside your organization, like your suppliers, your customers, et cetera? So the way that we measure inclusion, and if normally we do these longer workshops where we can actually do this exercise, but we literally use an online platform where, again, we ask for anonymous information about their demographics, and then we ask people to fill out these little cards where they tell us something that happened to them and then to categorize it. Now, the kinds of data that we get with this is astounding, and let me give you a couple of results. So the first thing that we can do, and these are data from a couple of real companies in the financial sector that we put together and anonymized. So the first thing that we can do is we can rank order the areas where you're having the biggest problems, and therefore the areas where you should focus. Respect, incidentally, is almost universally the biggest problem that we see. People feeling lack of respect. And the second thing that we can do is to say, where is that coming from? And in this particular case, we had a very senior population, meaning senior in the sense of professionally advanced population. So we actually had a lot of people for whom managers were actually part of the leadership. Normally, what we see is that managers are the biggest source of lack of respect. Leadership is second, peers is third, and that in general, it's people, not policies, that create problems. But I want to show you another thing. When we combine the sources of the exclusion with the categories, we can create these heat maps. And aside from the fact that they immediately help you to pinpoint, for example, for these organizations collectively, it looked like they had problems with leaders and managers being disrespectful. But what's super cool is that you immediately see what we mean when we say inclusion is invisible. And to do that, we took that same data and we sliced it by looking at the experience of Black women in these organizations. Notice how the numbers are much higher. There's much more deep red throughout the table. And here's what it looks like for white men. It's invisible. These people truly do not experience exclusion, okay? So, I'm gonna skip this slide. So I wanna conclude by telling you something about the value of measuring inclusion instead of representation. One of the things that people often talk about is the idea of how we're gonna be measuring diversity. The problem is that diversity is a lagging and indirect measure. You're doing something today that may take years to manifest itself, and it's influenced by a lot of other things, whereas inclusion is something that you can measure instantly, fix a problem, and measure it again. Also, whereas diversity and representation focus on differences, inclusion focuses on shared experiences. We're not placing people into buckets because inclusion applies to everybody. And we can account for intersectionality, as I just showed you, because we're literally measuring how, for example, being a queer Black woman impacts you differently than being just simply a queer white man, for example. And lastly, one of the things that we love about inclusion is that whereas diversity tends to encourage a zero-sum game mindset, let's abolish affirmative action because it's reverse racist, because we're giving jobs to Black people and hurting white people, which is crazy, but people think that. Instead, we can show with inclusion how we're growing the pie for everybody. So to wrap up, I hope that you got a sense of a different way to think about diversity and inclusion, why we believe that inclusion is crucial to performance and to diversity, why it's invisible, and how to measure it. And I would like to conclude by saying that there is no silver bullet. When people come to us and ask, what's the one thing that I can do? What's the silver bullet that's going to make my company more inclusive and diverse? I ask them, what's the silver bullet for sales? What are the two things that you can tell me that will guarantee that it will sell my products, that will guarantee that I will have the best marketing possible, that will guarantee that my product will sell like hotcakes? The answer is there is no silver bullet, because every organization is like a unique ecosystem. And what every organization shares is the importance of making sure that everybody feels included.